Hey, welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, in which we take a deeper look at the topic or passage of focus from the weekend, explore things that maybe we didn't have time to in the sermon. My name is Brad. I'm one of the pastors here at Calvary, joined by our interim lead pastor, Paul Utenage. Paul, welcome again.
Thank you very much. I love doing these deep dives. You guys have got a great thing going with this. It really helps people.
Yeah, it's a fun project, as we like to say on the deep dive. We want to keep our Bibles open, and so here we're just going to explore some different questions and go from there. So we've been in a series called "The Church the World Needs," where we're looking at the Book of Acts and walking through kind of passage by passage. We're going to end up going around 2/3 of the way through the book.
Yeah, we're really not hitting every passage, and there are some passages that are wonderful passages. We just don't have the time to be able to do it. So we're picking the passages that really fit the idea of what kind of church does the world need.
Yeah, I was last night. I was playing pickup basketball up here, and there were a couple guys from a different church in the area. And I asked them. I said, "Hey, what are you guys preaching through right now?" And they said, "Oh, we're going through Acts." I said, "Oh, awesome! We're going through Acts. That's cool. There's two churches in the area going through Acts." And I know this church, and they're very expository and they're very slow. So they've probably been going through Acts for months at this point.
There are some churches who will take more than a year just to go through Acts. In fact, it's not just here in St. Louis. It's something's going on.
Yeah.
If you Google it,
Yeah.
you also find that there are a number of other churches around the country that are doing Acts right now or just finished Acts.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, we're in good
So
company.
I think God's kind of speaking to his people right now. This is an ideal window and moment in our history.
Well, I do think coming out of the pandemic, we've seen attendance patterns shift, not just at our church, but just nationwide. I mean, worldwide, probably.
Yeah.
So we've seen people's engagement, involvement change. I think we're asking the question, like, what is the church, and who is the church, and what is the church to be? And so Acts is a great place to start. That's why we named this series "The Church the World Needs," because we're getting outside of our own walls.
Yeah, I love that you picked up the pandemic analogy, because it really was not just a pandemic, a health pandemic, but there was also a pandemic of relationships, a pandemic of values that the health one forced. And the church is still reeling. The church abroad is still reeling a little bit from it. And I think people still are without realizing it.
Yeah.
It's not called necessarily post-traumatic stress, but it's post-something.
Post something. Yeah. We Paul and I attended a conference back in February where there was a speaker, David Kinnaman, who he leads the Barnett Group, and he was talking about this moment as the spiritually open moment. So I think there are people, especially young people, who are searching for something spiritual to connect to. And for us, if we're gonna maybe leverage this moment or take advantage of this moment or just be faithful in this moment, I think really getting a good grip on what the church is, what is our mission, and then how do we take that next step to engage.
Yeah, and being able to talk with people through story, telling the story of Christ, which, of course, we just finished Cornelius, and the message that Peter gave to Cornelius really was a wonderful example of being just tell the story of Jesus. In fact, I almost wish everybody in the church could take time and homework, if you will.
Yeah.
We can't assign homework at church. But,
No.
But I wish we could, because then we would say, figure out from Peter's example how you'll tell the story of Jesus as a story, as a narrative.
Yeah.
Because everything is right there in what Peter tells Cornelius. It's one of the best examples for what our culture needs in the message.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that being said, okay, so we were in Acts chapter 10 this weekend. If you remember, if you listened last week, Jeff and we talked through Acts chapter 9, the conversion of Saul. And now we're this week we were in Acts chapter 10. So Paul, just give us kind of a big picture overview. What happens in chapter 10 of the book of Acts?
Well, 10 is, as I mentioned in the sermon, is one of the three most momentous events in early church history. You have the day of Pentecost first, which changed everything. You have the conversion of Saul, which would ultimately change everything. He would become this great Billy Graham, of the first century. And then you have this event, which basically is the birthday for all the Gentiles who ultimately will become Christians. It's your birthday and my birthday, basically.
All right, so you said the word Gentile. What does that mean? What is a
Okay,
Gentile?
Gentiles for Jews meant anybody who wasn't Jewish. And so it's a word that can be basically used as nations. And so there's times in the sermon, even when I said the word nations instead of Gentiles. And so it's really looking at anybody who does not hold to, in the Jewish mind, anybody who does not hold to the regulatory and the legal requirements of the religious and Israeli faith. So it wasn't just the scriptures. You have people like Cornelius who were God-fearing and would look at the scriptures. It's just that they refused to accept the legalistic, ritualistic pieces of Israel's life. And so they were considered God-fearing by God, is how he would call it. But Israel would not have considered them anything. So Cornelius never would have been able to get into the temple, just like the Ethiopian eunuch didn't get into the temple. He had to listen across the wall, as we talked about a few weeks ago. But Cornelius would have been that. And so what you've got here is God doing something absolutely amazing, just as he had done something absolutely amazing in Jerusalem. And so now everything moves now. It's no longer, Christianity is no longer a nationalistic group around just Israel. And it is no longer isolated to just Jerusalem and the immediate environment of Jerusalem. And so it is this very momentous event. I'm surprised that Christians don't talk about it more.
Yeah. So Peter, he gets this vision. He sees this kind of an odd vision that
Very odd.
I do think it is interesting. Because of where we're situated culturally, historically, sometimes the miraculous nature of how God worked in the early church. I mean, we have to remember he still does that, but we just maybe don't see it in the same way. And yet worldwide, right? There are men, women coming to faith in Jesus through visions and dreams. I mean, you hear stories of Africa where you have somebody in a very Muslim context have a vision or a dream where Christ appears, and it leads them on a path of discovering of who Jesus is. And so I do think it's important to know that God still works in those miraculous ways. But
the difference is that in the early church, when God was acting with a number of these miracles, the miracles were designed to authenticate the message. Now, when we see God working what we consider to be miraculously, it is to prove the reality and truth and the promise of that. So here's a quick little story. I know we didn't talk about Cornelius, but a little story for me. So when I was in high school, I was in ninth grade, I got the opportunity. So here's this dumb ninth grade guy, me. I had the opportunity to go with the Christian Medical Society with a doctor from Oklahoma City, from my home church, who actually was a youth sponsor. And we went down into southern Mexico and northern Guatemala with a bus that had been completely renovated to be basically a doctor's office on wheels.
Okay.
And we were taking medical things in, and then in the evening, they would do that all through the day. So I actually helped him. I helped the eye doctor. And we would then have the Jesus movie, that we would play in the evening on whatever wall in the village that we could. And then local missionaries would translate for us, and we'd share the gospel. A number of things happened on that trip for me that really kind of drove me to say, without realizing it was a part of my journey to drive me to do what I'm doing, as a pastor even. But in that, I met with the translator, but I met an older gentleman who came to get some help, medical help, and with eyes. And so as I was talking with him before he actually talked with Dr. Gilliland, Don Gilliland was the guy's name that I went with, I was just listening through the translator, the story, and he had walked hours and hours and hours from somewhere out, what we would call out in the boonies, if I can use my Okie language. So way out, not jungle, but way out there, because he had heard that there was some Christians who were bringing medical help. He came because of the medical help, but he also came because he was a Christian. When we listened, we were like, there's no church, there's nothing out there. And he said, I literally happened to be just walking in the forest in their area. Some plane went over, maybe some missionary plane or something, dropped out some pamphlets. He picked up a pamphlet, and he trusted Christ after reading it. Here I'm, this 9th grade guy, realizing God can do whatever he wants to get to people.
Yeah.
That was my high school experience. And I have remembered that story. I've met people now that I've traveled, overseas, of course, when I did that under the radar training of pastors and stuff. And I've met a number of people who have similar stories overseas, what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Of, we would say, is that made up? Well, no, it's not made up. It was a real, actual, God can do whatever he wants to get to people.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point. So Cornelius, right? He's this man from the Italian cohort, right? He's a devout man. He's a God God-fear, right? He has this dream, and he doesn't really understand what's going on. So, there's this guy Peter that he's supposed to find, right, and to come and explain it. Peter, then you pick up the story.
Another dream.
Yeah, has another dream.
So Peter, by the way, I've been at that house.
Wow.
When we were at Israel, now I mentioned it a little bit in the sermon.
Yeah.
But when we were at Israel on a tour, we happened to be walking through Joppa, and our guide said, "Let me just point out the house where Simon the tanner was. Archaeology has shown it. They know it was the house." And he said, "You can't get in. Somebody actually lives there."
Wow.
So we went, and we happened to bump up. We happened to go by as the guy's coming out of the door.
Yeah.
And the guide asked, would you be willing to show this group of people the house? He said, I'd be happy to.
Oh my goodness.
We got to go in.
So this guy's living in a 2,000-year-old house?
In a 2,000, yeah. Well, it's been, the bottom part's been, some of it has been, but it's kept, just like we would call a historic home, because it is a historic home. And so we saw the well that they had kept up historically, archaeologically, where they would have gotten their water, where the kitchen would have been when Peter said, "Hey, I'm hungry. While I'm praying, I'm hungry." I went up to the roof.
Wow.
I got to sit down on the roof. Yeah. Well, it's a modern chair.
Yeah.
Sat on this chair, looked out at the sea. I was actually I got to just picture. So here's Simon up on the roof back then, and he's praying at the appropriate time of prayer. Cornelius had been praying at the exact same time on another day, because it takes several days to travel. And God has this dream, this vision, because he'd gotten hungry, and so he had asked the servants to go down where I saw the kitchen. They were down there cooking, getting water from that very same well that I saw, that Brendan and I saw. And he has this vision of the blanket, if you will, that comes down and has all the animals that the Old Testament law ceremonially had said to either eat or not to eat.
Right.
And Peter had been a appropriately righteous young man growing up. And he really rebuked God, which is, it's amazing, because these are the things that God himself had said, don't eat. So here's God. At one level, it looks like God is contradicting himself. And Peter says, well, Lord, I've not. It's almost as if he may be thinking, is God testing me or something? Lord, I've not eaten those things. I've never eaten those things.
Yeah.
And, hey, Peter, basically he says, don't call unclean what I have called clean by the creation.
Yep.
In other words, he called all of it good in creation. And it happens 3 times, just like Peter. I didn't mention it in the sermon, but just like Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and it happens 3 times, and Peter's kind of like, there's a message for me here.
Yeah, he's kind of thrown for a loop. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm listening.
Yeah, and ding dong, at the door. You've got the servants coming in, and he realizes it, and he immediately changes his perspective, which is again another amazing piece. I love this story, by the way. You can
it's such
tell.
a good
You can
story.
probably tell.
Such a good story.
But he changes his perspective immediately about the Old Testament ceremonial law. Now, he doesn't fully get it because he and Paul argue about it later on.
Right.
In Galatians.
Well, we're stubborn.
Yeah, we
hard.
we all, I do that.
Yeah.
It takes me a few times,
Yeah.
or sometimes a lot of times.
Yeah.
But he gets, and then then we know the story with Cornelius, and now you have this great birthday of the Gentiles.
Yeah, you have Peter then, kind of another one of these monologues in Acts where he's preaching. The Gentiles hear and they respond.
And he knew, by the way, we know he got it because he goes. Of course, it would have been disobedience not to, but he goes.
Sure.
And he even says to Cornelius and to the whole household, the friends and the family that are, he says, this is the first time I've ever been in a Gentile home. He says, I've never done this before, because he had kept
very much
the law, and Jews had always seen any Gentile, anybody of other nations, they'd always seen them as unclean. You cannot connect with them.
Yeah.
He says, I would have loved to have been a bug on the wall.
For sure.
It's kind of like as he walked in, was he kind of looking around like, is something going to fall on me here?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, what does a Gentile house
Yeah.
look like? And he recognizes right off that he says, I'm doing something that I never would have done before, and none of my compatriots would have done before. And then the 6 guys that are with him as witnesses, they're from Antioch, where things had already started happening. And it was it's a great story.
Yeah, it's so good when the Holy Spirit falls right on the
Yeah,
Gentiles. And
same way as that day of Pentecost.
Yeah, Peter, preaches and says, "Hey, repent, and be baptized." Peter, what's the time at?
18 minutes.
All right, cool. We still got about 12 minutes. All right, well, there's a couple things that this story raises for me. One, this is kind of it's not the last time we see Peter in Acts, but we are going to see a movement from Peter to Paul.
Pretty almost immediately.
Yeah, you'll see, Peter's in 11 is going to report, on everything that he just experienced to the church. And so that is an interesting thing, but it's also the fulfillment of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, ends of the earth, and Paul is going to pick up that with Barnabas here. We're going to look at that next week, but I guess my question here, so a couple of years ago, my family and I, we were in Florida, Fort Walton Beach, and there's a place that we go to, when we go to the beach, that's where we go, and one of the last, actually, I think it was the last night we were there. I'm sitting down on the beach, just enjoying. Like the kids had just taken a nap or hadn't woken up from the nap yet, and so we were as a family going to get just have one last evening on the beach. But before my family comes down, there's a woman who she's just kind of walking, kind of aimlessly it seems. Then she walks over and she's like, "Hey, can I talk to you?" I'm like. I'm sitting there reading my book. It's my last day at the beach. I'm like, sure, what's up? So she sits down and she tells me this story. Now I don't know if her story was true or not. I in one sense I hope it wasn't true because it was pretty tragic. She had lost her husband recently. He's a firefighter. She's kind of just trying to find herself. So anyway, we get to talking, and then I'm like, okay, well I guess she was asking some faith type questions. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I should probably tell her I'm a pastor. So we get there, we're having a conversation. So she starts talking, asking me about, heaven and hell and, what happens after death, all these things. And, but anyway, once I mentioned to her that I'm a pastor, she starts wanting to talk about the Bible and talk about the Old Testament because she comes from a perspective where you still, as Christians, we still have to keep all of the Old Testament laws because God ordained them. He didn't get rid of them. My question, Paul, is this: clearly here in the in this passage, some of the Old Testament laws that had been set up, they're done. the character piece or the morale, there's a justification for them, and we can learn something from them, and they can mean something for us. But I guess what do we do as New Testament believers, right? What God's made, clean, like is clean. Like, what do we do with Old Testament ceremonial law?
Yeah.
And I guess maybe what are the different types of the law?
Yeah. So you do have aspects of the Old Testament that are moral laws, and you'll see them actually repeated in the New Testament. It's not that the New Testament says, by the way, I'm telling you what the Old Testament said, but it talks about the same things, and so there is moral law there. This is the very graphic story of what you just said of the ceremonial law ending. So it's not that God contradicted himself. I'm sure Peter probably thought God was. That's why I said earlier, I wondered if he really thought God was testing him.
Oh, he probably was so confused.
Yeah, he had to be so confused, especially. I get it that it took a few times.
Yeah.
It would have taken me probably more than 3.
Yeah.
But God was not contradicting himself. He was fulfilling his purposes in those things. And so he's bringing it to an end. So the ceremonial law was basically designed to be able to say everything is pointing to Christ. Well, really, everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Christ. You have the guys on the Emmaus Road, and I would have loved to heard that Jesus explain all the Old Testament. So even the moral law, all is connected. But God had in the Old Testament given these pictures at times, or these principles at times, these patterns at times that all pointed to either something about the coming Christ or our need for the coming Christ. And with some of the passages, it's simply reminding me and showing me that my heart simply cannot, I cannot live perfectly.
Yeah.
I cannot live.
Well, you think of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus be like, you've heard it said
That's excellent.
here, now I'm raising the bar.
Oh, that's excellent.
Right?
That's excellent. So what he's doing is he's saying everything has now been fulfilled in Christ. So you now have Christ having accomplished everything that the Old Testament had predicted and looked forward to.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that the Old Testament's through. In other words, there's still principles about life, it's just that it changes our motivation.
Yeah.
So I'm not having to keep them in order to receive satisfaction and God's acceptance. I'm keeping them out of my love for what Christ has done in order to have that relationship that's so clean and clear, my words.
Yeah.
And so the ceremonial laws, really, they were brought to an end. Paul's the one who will ultimately really draw that out.
Yeah, he'll axe it. Yeah.
And I'm sure that was a large part of his experience in the wilderness, those 3 years.
Sure.
If you think about it.
For him, especially Peter, right, would have grown up his whole life.
And he said he kept everything.
Yeah.
He would have been more adamant than Peter was.
Yeah.
And so there had to be a lot of training for Paul, from God in the wilderness years, for him to be so clear about it.
Yeah.
So much so that when Peter blows it later, Paul's the one who says, whoa, remember, let's not put something extra on the Gentiles. That was fulfilled in Christ.
You wonder what their experience was the first time they ate bacon. They probably felt so conflicted. And yet it's like, oh, this is amazing.
Or did it taste bad because of the grease? Who knows? But you got that. So now, these days, when people try to follow those ceremonial pieces, what they're doing is it's almost as they're claiming that Jesus didn't fulfill it all. And so we have to recognize that we want that. So what we do is we look to say, what was the principle behind that? How was it that those ceremonial laws were connected to moral, so to the natural law? What is another deep dive sometime about the natural law, which is a great apologetics, by the way, for dealing with non-Christians. So what was it that was somehow connected to the moral part of the natural law? And I've got a book actually I started reading about the moral law, and it's apologetics book about how to talk about it. But that's basically what's going on there.
Yeah, and I do think a lot of those laws, especially as God formed a people out of Abraham's family, gave after they came out of Egypt. Gave them the law, like everything in that was to separate them from everybody else for the purpose of everybody else seeing them and really having them faithfully accomplish their purpose of being a light to the nations. And when Christ comes, like, well, they don't need all of those things anymore to do that.
Yeah. When if I'm in conversation with somebody who says, no, you got to follow all of that, I use a word from my mom, stinker. So I kind of become a stinker because I ask them, so how many shoes have you got in your closet?
Yeah.
Oh, 3, 4. I said, then you're not living by the Old Testament. At least in the wilderness, God said, only take the sandals on your feet. Don't take more than that. So somehow you've realized that there's something different, because if I look at your closet, you're really not living a true legalistic life. And I know I'm being a jerk, when I do that. I'm jerking their chains. But it's a funny way to be able to do it. How many shoes have you got in your closet? So I say, you're not.
You're
not doing it.
Yeah, or hey, let's look at the tag on the shirt you're wearing.
What's it made of?
Is it 50%?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you, Paul. This has been
You're welcome. This has been fun.
This has been great. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, would love for you to put those in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to this on any of our audio podcast platforms, would love for you to just send us an email, podcast@calvary.church. If you have anything that maybe God's doing in your own study, or things that you're learning, things that you want to hear us talk about in future episodes of the Deep Dive. If you have any worship songs that you'd like to see or hear Caleb and I deep dive in a future date, we'd love to do that for you. Again, let's keep our Bibles open. Let's ask questions. It's so easy to just be jaded or skeptical, or even as Peter, as we were saying, like, was experiencing maybe, like, God, are you contradicting yourself? Like, I think that apologetically, we need to not be afraid of those questions, but we need to engage those questions and understand at a deeper level, hey, what is God doing and what is God communicating about the nature of his character? So let's keep our Bibles open. Let's ask those questions, and we'll catch you again next week on a new episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.